All right, guys, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Let me see. Yeah, it's already 10:05. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, Pretty normal week for us. You guys just have your chapter assignment. Big chapter this week on chapter 10, Jacksonian democracy. We're going to need to talk about some political dynamics leading into the era of Jackson. Then we'll talk about the Jackson era, his policies against the bank or war against the bank, the formation of this new political dichotomy, often referred to as the second party system, the formation of the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. And then we'll talk about his Indian removal policies, and get into the Martin Van Buren, a little bit of the Martin Van Buren administration, before next week focusing on the institution of slavery, what we call antebellum slavery. So yeah, let's dive right in. Anybody have any questions before we get started? Cool, let's do it. All right, guys. So last week you guys read about the market revolution, which is really much bigger than the market revolution. It's a transportation revolution and a information and communications revolution. You also read about the War of 1812, which had a significant impact on political dynamics in the country. As you read that Federalists really supported Great Britain. We know that Federalists supported a traditional alliance with Great Britain, and that sort of alliance or reliance on Great Britain carried into the War of 1812, whereas Democratic Republicans really opposed Great Britain, supported going to war. We have these new sort of nationalist Democratic Republicans like Henry Clay support going to war against Great Britain. Out of that, you really have the Federalist Party dismantled because they're seen as supporting our adversary in the War of 1812. This really leads to the end of the Federalist Party and ushers in what's often referred to as the era of good feelings, which describes this era beginning in 1815, 1816, well, with the election of 1816, of one party rule, where really the only predominant national party is the Republican Party. So that's where we'll start. We need to talk about the political dynamics of the era of good feelings, which was sort of a misnomer, right? Even though Federalists stopped identifying as Federalists and running on a Federalist ticket, Rufus King is the last major Federalist to run for president in 1816. James Monroe easily defeats Rufus King, which shows Federalists that they can no longer rely on the Federalist banner to help them get elected. So all these Federalists turn into Republicans, and we have this sort of era of two administrations of James Monroe, where everybody is considered a Republican, but we have internal divisions within the Republican Party itself. You have divisions between what are known as national, or what are really nationalist Republicans, focused on nationalist platforms, improving the United States from within, and then more traditional Republicans who still support this sort of agrarian, Jeffersonian republicanism that's about limited government and states' rights and limited foreign interaction and foreign entanglements, etc. So this era of good feelings is really sort of a misnomer, right? Although there is one party rule, we see the internal division between these nationalists, new Republicans, and these traditional states' rights, agrarian, Jeffersonian Republicans. And so we see this start to play out in several different areas, right? Slavery, the economy, the market revolution, the Bank of the United States. All of these areas are different platforms for these politicians to support their own agendas. Coupled with this, we see an increased political participation in the nation. This is largely due to what is often referred to as the information revolution. This is sort of a byproduct of the communications revolution, where we're now seeing, because of the telegraph, Morse code, that newspapers are able to report on events that are further and further away from their home newspaper printing press. Publications of newspapers skyrocket in the early 1800s, or really from the turn of the century through the Civil War. We have about 200 newspapers in circulation at the turn of the 19th century, 1800, and that increases to 3,000 different newspapers in circulation by the beginning of the Civil War. So we have this interesting combination of Americans being increasingly interested in politics, participating more and more in politics, and these new political dynamics begin to emerge between new political factions within the Republican Party. The Second Bank of the United States becomes a big issue within these new political dynamics. Remember, the First Bank of the United States was part of Hamilton's fiscal program, right? That we needed a strong central bank to help issue currency and lend money to smaller banks and set interest rates, so on and so forth. So it expires in 1811. But during the War of 1812, a lot of Americans realized that we need an integrated economy to help with war efforts, to help with international diplomacy or international economic relations. So when it expires in 1811, in 1816, after the election of 1816, the Republican Party starts to look at the Bank of the United States and recharters it in 1816 for a 20-year charter. So that means it'll last until 1836. The Second Bank of the United States will very much function like the First Bank of the United States. And we see that this issue is going to facilitate some internal factionalism, some internal division within the Republican Party. And you start to see new leaders emerge that either support the Second Bank of the United States or oppose it. A lot of these traditional Republicans oppose it, right? They don't want more federal intervention in the economy. They basically want a limited federal government, and they see this as an extension of federal powers. These new nationalist Republicans, which are mainly led by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams at this point, support the Second Bank of the United States. They see it as an important piece in what will come to be known as the American system. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So this is one of the main issues that's dividing these Republicans between nationalist and traditional Republicans. Then in 1819, we go through a pretty significant economic recession. This is a pretty complicated economic recession, but basically it comes down to an expansion of our economy after the War of 1812, where we're selling a lot of products to foreign countries. A lot of new territories are being opened up after the Louisiana Purchase to American farmers. We're producing a lot more products. Americans are trying to buy up land. There's this huge land rush after the War of 1812. And then when demand for American agricultural products dips back down in 1819, because European markets are recovering, they're not demanding American cotton as much. We start to see the banks try to collect on these land purchases. A lot of these small farmers can't afford to pay their mortgages. This leads to this sort of a snowball effect where Americans lose their land. Banks try to collect on delinquent land payments. Banks themselves start closing across the South. And it's this snowball effect that's often referred to as the Panic or the Crisis of 1819. So after the War of 1812, we have this unique period of sort of patriotism and this sort of sensationalized American patriotic sentiments, which leads a lot of these traditional Republicans to support what are really federalist economic agendas, like the Second Bank of the United States, like expanding American infrastructure. And they're really these national Republicans disguised, or Federalists disguised as national Republicans, passing these reforms. Another one is the tariff, right? Tariffs protect American industry by charging foreign companies more to sell their products on American soil. So because of the crisis of 1819, the Second Bank of the United States is very new. It was just chartered in 1816. And we're going to start to see a lot of, especially Southern Americans, blame the banking system for the crisis. So this is another sticking point that leads a lot of these traditional Republicans to start to factionalize, to start to separate themselves from these national Republicans who have passed these economic agendas like the Second Bank of the United States, the Tariff of 1816, so on and so forth. So this is another one of those sort of divisive issues that is really illustrating the separation within the Republican Party, especially as more and more of these traditional Republicans come out in opposition to the Second Bank of the United States. Another big issue is slavery, right? Slavery is still at the forefront of politics. Your book kind of covers the Missouri Compromise in both last week's chapter and this week's chapter. Make sure you guys understand the Missouri Compromise. It's basically the issue of extending slavery or prohibiting slavery in new territories that were purchased in the Louisiana Purchase under the Jefferson administration. So as more and more Americans are flooding west into these new territories, remember this process of gaining admission into the Union means you have to meet certain population requirements. Well, Missouri already has thousands and thousands of slaves and thousands of American farm families. And by 1819, 1820, they want to be admitted into the Union. Well, the North has already taken steps to abolish slavery in the North. By 1820, the North is largely an abolitionist political section. We see major sectionalism, meaning if you were from the South, you largely voted for measures that protected the institution of slavery. If you were from the North, you voted for measures that limited the institution of slavery. And many Northerners, especially these new national Republicans, believe that the federal government can impede on or regulate the institution of slavery. So during this debate over whether or not Missouri would be admitted into the Union, a big issue is maintaining a balance of power within Congress. So we remember that Southern states have long been worried about not having enough representation in Congress, right? They have smaller populations. The North has far greater populations. So the North has more representation in the House. The South is fighting to have more representation in the Senate so that they can offset this power dynamic and challenge Northern political factions in the Senate. So Missouri wants to be admitted as a slave state. Southern states support this because this will be another slave state represented in the Senate. The North is weary of this because they don't want slave states to have too much power. So a compromise is brokered. Henry Clay is very much central to this compromise. Henry Clay is often referred to as the great compromiser or the great orator. He'll become the figurehead of the Whig Party, which we'll talk about in a bit, which are really these national Republicans' new political party after the election of 1828. So the components of the Missouri Compromise are that Missouri can be admitted as a slave state. Maine will be cut out of Massachusetts and admitted as a free state to maintain the balance of power. There'll be 12 free and 12 slave states. The northern boundary of Missouri, the 3036 parallel, will be created as a boundary that no slave states north of that line or no new states north of that line will be admitted as slave states. So this again illustrates this division between national Republicans, traditional Republicans, who are starting to be aligned sectionally, right? Where national Republicans are predominantly from the North, support the American system, Henry Clay, a larger federal government, internal improvements, support the Second Bank of the United States, support tariffs to protect American industry. And then you have the traditional Republicans who support limited federal government, want to limit the federal government's influence on regulating slavery, who want more representation in Congress, who want more states' rights over federal rights, and who support this traditional agrarian republicanism. Even though by the 1820s, 1830s, this model really doesn't fit because of the amount of the large population that the United States already has. So make sure you guys understand the Missouri Compromise. So all of this sort of comes to a head in the election of 1824. Monroe serves administration serves two terms, 1816 to 1820, and then to 1824. And so we're able to see all of this political division play out in the election of 1824. Another issue that really illustrates these new nationalist tendencies is the Monroe Doctrine. So during this era of good feelings, even briefly prior to the era of good feelings, prior to the War of 1812, beginning in about 1810 or so, we have a lot of Latin American nations go through their own revolts, right? Revolting against their European subjugators, they're colonists. And we have places like Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru, Mexico, right, in 1821 goes through its independence movement, start to shed their subjugators there, the empires that had controlled these territories, and establish independent Latin American nations. So Monroe is worried about the impetus of these new Latin American nations that he thinks are susceptible to foreign influence. Not only Spain, but France is looking to extend their influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russia is looking to extend their influence along the west coast of North America, up into Canada. So it's really John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State under James Monroe, that convinces Monroe to issue a doctrine to basically establish our presence in the Western Hemisphere as sort of a leader or a policing force in the Western Hemisphere. So this is really a nationalist idea, right? Support America's position of power in the Western Hemisphere for our own benefit. What the real motivation of the Monroe Doctrine was to open up Latin American markets to American products, right? At the same time, the market revolution is going on. We're manufacturing a lot more products. And Quincy Adams knows that if we establish ourselves as defenders of these Latin American nations, that's going to open them up to sell American products, and it'll be good for America's economy. So there's three tenets of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. would oppose any further efforts to colonize any areas of the Western Hemisphere. Europeans trying to come in and colonize, establish European presence in any of these Latin American nations. The U.S. in turn would agree to abstain from any involvement in European conflicts. I mean, outside of the Barbary Wars, we're really not in a position to go and involve ourselves in European wars anyway. And the last is a warning not to interfere with any of these newly independent nations. So again, this is just sort of a way for the United States to declare itself in a position of power on the Western Hemisphere. So again, we see a division here where John Quincy Adams, Monroe, Henry Clay, these national Republicans, support the Monroe Doctrine and establishing ourselves as a presence or a policing force in the Western Hemisphere. All right, so all this plays out in the election of 1824. We see John Quincy Adams running against Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay is in there as well. There's several candidates, and none of the candidates win a majority of the electoral college, enough of a majority to be declared the outright winner. Andrew Jackson, you read about last week, is already famous for his involvement in the War of 1812. His basically a legal war against the Red Stick Creeks in Alabama. He's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, which happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. So he's already sort of a national figure and sort of a figurehead of this traditional Jeffersonian republicanism. So Jackson wins 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams, who's seen as an extension of James Monroe, and in many ways a figurehead of the nationalist Republicans, wins 84. Jackson also wins 43% of the popular vote. Clay is in there, which really sort of splits the ticket for national Republicans. And so the choice falls to the House of Representatives. This is an old tenet of the American electoral system, where if nobody receives an outright majority of the electoral college votes, the House of Representatives declares a winner. So behind the scenes, Clay realizes that he's in a position to help choose the next president, and in turn help choose the platform that the next president will support. So Clay drops out. He throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, and he tells Quincy Adams, listen, if I convince the House of Representatives to select you as the next president, then you need to make me Secretary of State. This is known as the corrupt bargain. Quincy Adams says, okay, makes Clay Secretary of State. Clay uses his political influence in the House to get the House to select John Quincy Adams. This is despite the fact that more Americans wanted Andrew Jackson to be president than John Quincy Adams. More states voted for Andrew Jackson over John Quincy Adams. So this sets up this political rivalry between Henry Clay, representing nationalist Republicans, and Andrew Jackson, representing traditional Republicans. There's another politician behind the scenes, a man named Martin Van Buren, who is referred to, his nickname is the Little Magician, because he sees an opportunity here to form a new political coalition of these traditional Republicans that want to combat these nationalist tendencies that don't support the American system. And so he starts to work behind the scenes at forming this new political coalition, which will come to be known as the Democratic Party. After the traditionalist Republicans leave and form the Democratic Party, which is first represented in the election of 1828, the remaining national Republicans also form a new party and start calling themselves the Whigs. So that's the second American party system, Whigs versus Democrats. The first is Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, right, who are actually anti-Federalists. So we go through several of these party systems throughout American history. So this leads Jackson to start casting, it's already 10:30. This leads Jackson to start sort of casting the Whig Party, or the National Republicans, as the party of the elites. In turn, he wants to represent himself, or he wants to sort of describe himself as the populist candidate. He is the party of the people. And this is really a brainchild of Martin Van Buren, who realizes that a lot of Americans still want to support this limited government, agrarian economic models, states' rights over federal authority, these old tenets of traditional Jeffersonian republicanism. So this really plays out in the tariff negotiations of 1824. Tariffs of 1816 were originally supported by everyone. This was during the era of good feelings. Even hardcore states' rights Democrats like John Calhoun supported the initial tariffs because they thought that it would help cotton manufacturers cotton growers in the South to sell their products on an international scale. Also, they didn't want to compete with Brazilian and the advent of Egyptian cotton here on American soil. By 1824, a lot of these Republicans who supported the tariffs in 1816, supported the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, have changed their opinion. And they no longer want to support tariffs. They no longer want to support the bank. They no longer want to support the American system. And Clay, being the great orator that he is, addresses Congress in 1824 to try to gain support for another round of tariffs to support American manufacturing. It's then when he famously states there's a remedy, and that remedy consists in modifying our foreign policy and adopting a genuine American system. So this will inextricably link these nationalist Republicans to the tenets of the American system. And there's three main tenets of the American system: support for the Second Bank of the United States, internal improvements based on government spending, subsidies for manufacturers, building roads and canals that will help facilitate commerce across the country, and government subsidies to help, and the protective tariff, right? So the second bank, internal improvements, and the protective tariff. Those are the three tenets of the American system. So the tariffs offer Southerners an opportunity to really oppose this nationalist economic agenda. And they really oppose these protective tariffs that they initially supported. So this gets a bit confusing, but this is really tied to the market revolution. More and more Southerners by the 1820s believe that the market revolution is disproportionately benefiting the North, because the North is the seat of manufacturing and industry, while the South is still largely reliant on agriculture. The South takes a long time to industrialize. That's one reason that they're so dedicated to maintaining the institution of slavery, because their economies rely on agriculture, whereas Northern economies are becoming increasingly reliant on industry and manufacturing. So even people like Calhoun, these hardcore states' rights advocates that supported the tariff of 1816, are now staunchly opposed to the tariffs in 1824. The debate plays out in Congress. The tariffs pass in 1824 by a very small margin, 107 to 102. And this allows for a period during the John Quincy Adams administration to pursue a lot of these nationalist economic policies. All right. So you've already learned a little bit about Martin Van Buren, but this is really when Martin Van Buren sees an opportunity to bring together these traditional Republicans who feel like they have been pushed out of the Republican Party by these new nationalist Republican tendencies. And you'll recognize that a lot of these economic platforms are similar to the Federalist economic platforms, right? A central bank, more federal authority in regulating economic practices, tariffs to support American manufacturing. So a lot of these are sort of Federalist economic platforms in disguise. Martin Van Buren believes that one-party rule isn't healthy for the American political system. He believes that there needs to be an option, there needs to be a two-party system, that's healthy for the American political system. There needs to be options, there needs to be conflicting ideas. So he brings together these politicians, and he wants to bring together traditional Republicans from different parts of the country. He realizes that the tariff negotiations fell along sectional lines. Like I said, Southerners didn't want the tariff. Southerners didn't believe that the market revolution was benefiting the South. Northerners did support the tariff. Northerners did support the American system. So Martin Van Buren, who's actually from New York, is worried about this sectionalism. He thinks it's bad for the US. So he starts to build this political coalition of traditional Republicans from different areas across the country. He's actually from Old Kinderhook, New York. That's where we get the term okay. He would say, if you're from Old Kinderhook, you're okay by me. So he brings together this party, realizes that these debates like the Missouri Compromise, the Talmadge Amendment, the tariff debate is creating sectionalism in the country. So he wants to bring together laborers from the North, disenfranchised whites from across the country, planters and small farmers from the South and the Midwest, settlers from the West in new territories that are being settled from the Louisiana Purchase, all together into the Democratic Party. And of course, he chooses Andrew Jackson to be the figurehead of this new Democratic Party because of his political capital, right? Because he is a political celebrity already from his involvement in the War of 1812. So for 4 years, Jackson has been ridiculing and mudslinging and besmirching the nationalist Republicans. He's cast them as the party of the elites. John Quincy Adams comes from a political legacy, right? John Adams was his father, father. So he casts them as these elitists who have lost touch with the common man. On the other side, we have these national Republicans who cast Andrew Jackson as a political outsider, someone who is inexperienced and doesn't have the resume to lead the country. So for 4 years, this is building up Clay versus Jackson, Clay versus Jackson, John Quincy Adams versus Jackson, and Martin Van Buren, etc. Then in the election of 1824, it all comes to play out. And it's one of the dirtiest elections in American history, where there's political mudslinging and, Martin Van Buren utilizes this sort of new progressive campaign that brings together grassroots organization and uses the information revolution to use newspapers to really promote the Democratic Party. Adams, on the other hand, believes that he can just rest on his name, that he doesn't need to campaign, that he'll win election again easily because Americans want political legacies, right? So on the one hand, you have Jackson claiming that John Quincy Adams is an elitist who, was raised with a silver spoon, that has never had to face any conflict, that he was a privileged part of this political legacy. Adams claims that Jackson is a war criminal for his illegal war against the Red Stick Creeks, claims that Jackson is a murderer. They actually issue what is known as the Coffin Bill, which is an advertisement showing coffins representing everyone that Jackson had murdered in duels throughout his life, which was true. Jackson was known to be a very hot-headed individual and often challenged people to duels and won those duels. And they also get personal. They claim that Jackson was an adulterer. He had married his wife, Rachel, sort of when Tennessee was still a frontier territory. It was difficult for her to get an annulment from her previous marriage. And so they got married before her annulment or her divorce actually went through. So they claim that Jackson is an adulterer who stole his wife from her husband, et cetera. It gets really personal in their mudslinging. It's actually a very depressing end to that story as Rachel goes into a significant panic attacks and so forth because of this public ridicule. She actually dies the day that Jackson is inaugurated into his presidency. Spoiler alert, Jackson wins the election of 28. And Jackson's running as a populist, right? He's a man of the people. So when he wins, he opens up the White House to Americans to come party during his inauguration celebration. That turns out to be a terrible idea. Drunken Americans end up vandalizing the Capitol building, the White House. It's sort of a national scandal. But this ushers in the age of Jackson. So the election of 1828 has shown that this political participation, this increased interest in politics, has led to this sort of populist grassroots movement that is now reflected in the new Democratic Party. And this is sort of an era of political celebrity, because these politicians are the most prominent Americans because of the advent of these new newspapers and this increased interest in politics and reading and news media and the press. So we have this sort of the election itself was a big spectacle, right? With this mudslinging and these very public declarations. This is an era where we see politicians get nicknames and become sort of these national popular culture figures in many ways, right? Jackson is Old Hickory, and Martin Van Buren is the Little Magician, and Henry Clay is the Great Compromiser, and a little later on down the road, James Polk is Little Hickory because he's seen as the embodiment of Andrew Jackson in the 1840s. Old Rough and Red. All of these nicknames sort of reflect how politicians have become celebrities. Jackson realizes this, and in his cabinet, his closest advisors, he brings in newspaper editors, people that sort of take the pulse of American politics and understand American political opinions. And he really plays into these Democrats' fear over the impact of the market revolution, right? He's saying that the new Democratic Party represents the working man. The market revolution disproportionately benefited the rich, the aristocracy, these elites, and this really breaks down to a North-South dichotomy. Democrats are largely supported in the South, although Jackson wins significant votes in the North in 1828. We'll see by 32, it's almost entirely sectional, where if you're from the South, you vote Democrat. If you're from the North, you vote Whig. All right, so in this vein, he also supports this notion of the producers versus the non-producers, right? He claims that the producers are this working class faction of Americans, farmers and factory workers and laborers, people that actually produce something on a daily basis. He says the political elites, the Whigs, support the non-producers, merchants and lawyers and sort of mainstay politicians or career politicians. So this is a populist platform, right? Jackson runs on this notion that he's representing the population against the political system. He chooses John Calhoun, who's a very staunch advocate of states' rights. He's a states' rights Democrat from South Carolina. But honestly, Calhoun's main motivation in this sort of states' rights platform is to make sure that the federal government can't intervene in the institution of slavery. John Calhoun is a major proponent of slavery and fears the federal government's extended power in limiting the expansion of slavery. Well, almost immediately, Calhoun and Jackson are at odds. They're both sort of egomaniacs who want as much power and attention as possible. There's some personal issues that are going on behind the scenes. You'll read about the Peggy Eaton affair. It's basically this issue where Fluoride Calhoun leads a group of these socialites in Washington against the wife of John Eaton, who was the Secretary of War. Her name is Peggy Eaton. And behind the scenes, you have these political socialites, these women married to very powerful men, forming groups against one another, bickering against one another. This sort of ostracizes John Calhoun. Jackson sides with Peggy Eaton and his Secretary of War, John Eaton. At the same time, Jackson really works closer with Martin Van Buren than he does with John Calhoun. So Calhoun feels as though he has been sort of pushed out of the party. His beliefs and his voice isn't being heard within the Democratic Party because the engine behind the Democrats is really Jackson and Martin Van Buren. So then Calhoun, by 32, once the nullification crisis commences, actually splits with Andrew Jackson, decides to step down as vice president because he thinks he can have a more significant impact on politics as a senator, inflicting his influence on the Senate rather than being a VP, which he sees as being sort of a toothless position. So he leaves and he joins the Whig Party to a certain extent, although he's not really a true Whig. He forms this sort of what's often referred to as the Great Triumvirate with Henry Clay and another prominent Whig known as Daniel Webster, or a man named Daniel Webster. Okay, so this comes down to, so this split is largely facilitated by what is known as the nullification crisis. This is about nullifying the, nullifying the tariffs and the Second Bank of the United States. Okay, first we have to talk about Jackson's Indian removal acts. Jackson, since taking office, constantly refers to Native Americans as savages, believes that Native Americans are less than whites, doesn't believe Native Americans can truly be assimilated into American society. You read about his war against the Red Stick Creeks in Alabama. He also has some very specific animosity towards the Seminole Indians in Florida. And he also wants to open up new territories in the South to American farmers. Again, the cotton boom is really starting to crank up, and the cotton kingdom is really being established in the South. So the South is more and more reliant on cotton as its main export to make money for the South. Remember, the South is very slow to industrialize, so they're largely reliant on a few agricultural products, rice, sugar, tobacco to a lesser extent, and now mainly cotton to sustain Southern economies. So in 1830, he issues the Indian Removal Act of 1830 to provide federal funds to forcefully remove what are known as the 5 civilized tribes from the American South. That's the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. This is sort of a loose definition. This civilized tribe is a loose definition, especially as the Seminoles are some of the most hesitant, or some of the most, they go against the assimilation tactics of the federal government. So this gives the federal government power to use the army, the military, to forcefully remove Native Americans from their traditional territories in what is now Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia to a lesser extent, or a little bit of Georgia, etc. So this is the federal government literally going in and rounding up these Native American tribes. They put them in stockyards, literally what's used to herd together cattle, and force them to march to Oklahoma, where they'll be given new federal land to compete over amongst each other. This is a design, this is a plan designed to make these Native Americans kill each other over limited resources in Oklahoma. The reason the federal government chooses Oklahoma is because it's one of the worst areas of the country to cultivate agricultural products. It's what's known as the Upper Plains, where there's a lot of wind. It's an arid area. There's not a lot of water. The soil isn't very rich. So Jackson knows that they're going to be competing against each other for limited resources in Oklahoma, and this is a way for Native Americans to kill each other, which Jackson sees as a benefit for the federal government, because he sees the federal government as having a responsibility to provide access to new territories to cultivate products to stimulate Southern economies. So within this Indian removal policy, you have this tragic story of the Cherokees, who really do try to assimilate into American culture. They set up American schools, they adopted written laws and a constitution that's modeled after the US Constitution, but Jackson still categorizes them as savages who can never truly be white Americans, never can truly be part of American culture. So he forces them along the Trail of Tears with the rest of the Cherokee, I'm sorry, the Chickasaw, Choctaw Creek, and Seminoles. So this leads them on the Trail of Tears, where they're forced to march from their traditional territories to Oklahoma. Along the Trail of Tears, over a quarter of these Native Americans die of starvation, of heat exhaustion, of lack of water, lack of resources. So a quarter of these Native Americans die. By 1837, a 6.5-year period, 46,000 Native Americans have been forcefully removed from their native territories, forced to live in Oklahoma. One group is particularly resistant to this, and that is the Seminoles. There's a Seminole War, often referred to as the Second Seminole War in 1835, where the Seminoles are fighting the federal government to maintain occupation of their traditional territory. There's about 1,500 casualties on each side. Finally, about 3,000 Seminoles move, but the US government has to bend and grant certain tracts of land in Central Florida to the Seminole Indians, and sets up a sort of a reservation system where they grant them autonomous authority over certain lands. So the Seminoles, in many ways, win that Second Seminole War. Okay, so let's talk about Jackson's War on the Bank. So the charter was, the Second Bank of the United States charter was passed in 1816, right? During this period of sort of patriotism where they're passing tariffs and the bank system and a lot of these American tenets of the American system. Nicholas Biddle persuades Congress to vote early on rechartering the Second Bank of the United States. So instead of waiting till 36, he brings it up to Congress in 32 to extend the charter, and they approve to extend the charter another 20 years. Well, this pisses off Jackson, who thinks that the Second Bank of the United States is a functionary of the Whigs, or the Nationalist Republicans. And so he vetoes the bill. He's the first president to use his veto as sort of a political weapon. He then narrowly wins the election of 32, despite being in the middle of this controversy over the banks. Once he wins, he knows he has more authority now to pursue increasingly democratic platforms. And one thing that he wants to do is destroy the Second Bank of the United States. In Jackson's eyes, this represents a sort of aristocracy, or this sort of elitism that is supported by, in his eyes, the Whigs. So Jackson removes all federal funds from the Second Bank of the United States and passes an executive order, or issues, I'm sorry, doesn't need to pass, issues an executive order to give himself increased power to allocate funds from the Second Bank of the United States to what are known as pet banks. They're known as pet banks because he gives these banks money based on their support of Jackson's political party. If you supported Democrats in the election of 1832, you're going to get money from the Second Bank of the United States. So they're known as Jackson's pet banks. So he starts depositing at his own discretion money into these banks that are mostly in the South, mostly supporting states' rights over, federal government, and people that oppose the Second Bank of the United States and supported Jackson's political ambitions. So to give you a sense of how this affected the banking system, about $10 million worth of banknotes are circulated in 1833. By the end of this pet bank scandal, about $150 million worth of banknotes are issued by 1837. If you have that huge of an increase in issuing paper currency, then you're going to have inflation, right? Where the price of your dollar, the price of your currency goes down significantly and the cost of goods inflates. So this really hurts the value of the American dollar. Well, now Jackson realizes he's made a mistake with sort of disrupting the foundation of America's economy by killing the Second Bank of the United States. And so he's worried that inflation is going to go out of control. So he issues the Specie Circular, where he declares all land sales need to be paid with specie, which are gold coins. So either gold or silver coins are known as specie. So this is to stop inflation, to get back on a reliance on hard money, right? Gold and silver. But what it really does is further devalue American currency, and foreigners start to distrust America's economy. And so by 37, the economy has collapsed because of Jackson's illegitimate war on the banks and because of his specie circular declaration. So we go into a significant recession after his presidency in 36, which really starts in 37. And guess who's next up on the Democratic ticket? Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren becomes president in 37. He's blamed for this economic recession that was really started because of Jackson's own sort of egocentrism and forcing the Second Bank of the United States to close and removing federal funds and dispersing them to these pet banks, which really destabilizes the American economy. All right, guys, just in time. So make sure you guys understand Jackson's policies on Native Americans, his position on the bank, his position on tariffs. Make sure you guys understand this dichotomy between Whigs and Democrats, what the Whig platform supports, what the Democrat platform supports. Make sure you understand the election of 1824, election of 1828, Martin Van Buren's impact on forming the Democratic Party, Henry Clay's impact on the American system, economic platforms of the Whigs versus Democrats, states' rights for Democrats versus national federal authority for Whigs, so on and so forth. Any questions for me, guys? All right, well, thank you very much. You guys have a good week. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.